Hey, friend, it's Michael. I want you to take a look at your social media timeline of choice if you're on social media. I know some people aren't. What's the tone that you experience there? What kind of content do you see most often? Would you say it trends more positive or negative? And perhaps most importantly, do you find yourself paying attention to things there that you ultimately cannot control? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. Back in episode 75, I had Dominic Packer on the show to discuss the book he co-authored with his colleague and friend, Jay Van Bavel. It was called The Power of Us. And Dominic and I discussed, among many topics, a phenomenon where studies show that the more hostile and negative the content is online and on social media, the faster it spreads. Now, to add to that, I recently read a Twitter, or I guess X, post by Jay, Dominic's co-author, that presented data that shows that the most hateful and hostile expressions on the platform drive engagement because the recommendation algorithm amplifies it. It amplifies the angriest content, which fuels out-group hostility and drives up affective polarization, where it becomes easy to believe that entire groups of people are not just wrong, but evil. You don't have to look too hard to see it happening. One such example I've seen is the continuous amplification of the message that all conservatives or Republicans, little r, and yes, I'm using those words interchangeably when perhaps I shouldn't be, but the message that all conservatives or Republicans are dangerous, evil, Trump-loving fascists. Now, simply put, this is not true. But it keeps getting perpetuated, and the voices that offer a counter to the belief are drowned out. And to be clear, the same thing happens to the left. Reductionist language that stirs negativity about an entire group of people abounds. Which is why I'm excited to share with you this conversation with my guest, Josh Lewis. Josh is the host of Saving Elephants, a podcast and blog espousing the goodness and benefits of the conservative tradition in the United States. Josh, a millennial like me, believes that conservatism has been hijacked by bad actors. Yet if true conservatism is to survive, where the wisdom of the past is applied to the challenges of the present, then it will be up to millennials to recapture its true meaning. In 2016, Josh stepped down as the treasurer of the Tulsa County, Oklahoma Republican Party when he saw conservatism going in a direction that strayed from its historical foundations. Josh and I discuss his draw to the original premise and promises of conservatism, and we of course discuss the modern Republican Party, Big R, and Donald Trump, as well as Josh's overarching belief that true conservatism embraces lively yet civil dialogue. You wrote that if conservatism is to survive the 21st century, it will be up to millennials. Why do you believe that? Let's jump right off the deep end, right from the get go. Why do you believe it's up to us millennials to save conservatism?
Well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for having me on. I need to admit I'm a little nervous because I have no idea what you're going to ask me, but I can make for the most fun conversations. No, that's a tall task, right? You and I and the rest of we millennials have to shoulder this burden. And and I do believe that, but I believe that from say two different angles. One is it is up to every generation for a conservative ethos, if you will, to survive. In any sense, I suppose one could argue you could, in theory, resuscitate these things years later, but conservatism is trying to pass down those that wisdom of the past, right? The things that
Mhm,
have worked in the past, the things that either through revelation or through reason or through practice we believe work and we hold value in, and that necessarily means a linking between generations. This is what Edmund Burke, the originator, if you will, of modern conservatism, referred to as the linking between the three generations. You and I, people who have yet to be born, and those who have died. The only ones who can do anything about it right now are those who are around, and we are working for the future while we recognize the traditions to respect the past. All that said, so that's in a very general sense, but I also think we millennials have a particular responsibility in that we are in a seismic political shift in this
mhm,
country. It's not the only time this has happened. Certainly has happened before, but modern conservatism, in the sense that I uh, proffer as the hopeful solutions to some of our problems, is remarkably new in comparison with like classical liberalism, libertarianism, even socialism. It really doesn't come on the scenes in the way we think of it today until around the 1950s. And in a lot of ways, it was a response to FDR and the New Deal and the prevailing liberal orthodoxy. And that newness, I think, offers a certain fragility to it. There's a certain freshness that invigorates it, but there's also fragility. And I think that millennials in particular are the we're this weird generation that knows what the before time looked like before the advent of the internet
mhm.
promulgating and social media and all
Yes, we
that.
do.
And so we understand that, while we also, I think, understand better than our elders this brave new world we're in. So I think we are the inheritors of trying to understand how to translate this somewhat new political movement that is nonetheless attached to thousands of years of tradition to an audience that has no idea what this world used to look like.
That's true for a lot of things just outside of politics. Millennials are that kind of
Yeah.
bridge generation between the pre-internet and post-internet eras. So it's I can of course remember getting the internet for the first time in my house, and that first smartphone, all that stuff. But if with what you said, if that's the case, where in your mind, Josh, has conservatism strayed that makes it in need of, I'll say it makes it in need of saving, or something
Mhm.
to be saved from extinction, to use kind of your survival language there as well. Where has it strayed in your mind?
All over the place. I mean, this is another one of those questions that, like, it depends on what level we want to have the conversation at, right? Because on the one hand, we can say conservatism has strayed in its common vernacular. In other words, when you hear people in the media refer to someone as the far right, well, let me stay off of far right because that can have its own connotations. The more conservative candidate, the irony is what they often are describing as an individual who their disposition is anything but conservative. They're more radical, which is ironically the opposite of conservatism. Now, I don't mean to imply that conservatives all have to be mild mannered and very moderate, but rather, I think it is straight in the mind of the average individual into what that even means in the first place. Typically, today, when we say more conservative, what we mean is some sort of an allegiance to an individual such as Donald Trump or a movement such as MAGA America, which contain conservative elements. I'll be the first to admit that. But that's not necessarily the original understandings of these sort of deeper intellectual traditions. The second, I guess, tier I would say, in light of you open the question about us millennials, is I think that, and maybe this kind of gets back to your first question, two big areas in my mind that I think really screwed up the millennial generation in our ability to embrace conservatism was the advent of the War on Terror and then the 2008 market collapse, which, in my view, did not, but understandably, seemably uh, disproved or at least discredited the rights arguments for the free market and also international
Mm.
policy. And I think in a way there was a lot of ways in which our elders kind of grew up in this world where they've already had these battles about socialism, good or bad, or the new world order. How do we put together a post World War II society? And so it didn't ping their brains quite like it did ours when we were coming of age, when the war on terror, post 9/11, and also the great economic recession of 2008 happened. And I think that means that there are understandable reasons why millennials feel as if the natural arguments of conservatism has been invalidated, and we've never been talked to and treated like adults when we say we have serious concerns about this. How do you square this circle? Now, that's different than, say, like you talk to somebody in Gen Z, and I have these conversations occasionally, like, what are you talking about? I don't, it's kind of past history to them. They're not as concerned about that. They have their own concerns. But I guess that's where I would go when I say that that's one of the reasons I think is in need of saving. And you can slice this up for each generation, but I think that's our generation's challenge for conservatives like me, is to respond specifically to those threats to the movement.
Yeah, those two instances, the post 9/11 kind of war on terror and the 2008 economic recession or crisis, or however you want to label it, both happened at very distinct points in our lives, right? I was a senior in high school when 9/11
Yes.
happened, and then we were just graduating from college, or of that entering the job market age when that 2008 recession hit. For both of those instances, in what ways did you see you used the phrase, I believe, invalidated the conservative approach to international relations and economics. In what ways did you see that take place? Let's start with international relations. What do you think damaged the conservative ethos or mindset there?
Well, and I think you even see that, ironically, even in the right today, that there is, you can get a lot of mileage as a political candidate bad mouthing the policies of this era, right? No
Yeah.
more war on no more endless wars.
Mhm.
And that's certainly it's a valid talking point. I'm not saying we can't have these arguments. But it damaged it to such a degree that it's almost as if we don't have the debates. Well, why were the wars started in the first place? And that's a really complex issue. I don't necessarily mean to open that can of worms. What my particular views are on it, but I think from the standpoint of, and here I'm going to super simplify things. If by conservatives' international policy, we mean that this world is a scary and dangerous place to a system of ordered liberty, that it necessarily requires a certain amount of vigilance and possibly at times even aggressive defense of our liberties. Now, that's a very broad statement. You can apply that in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Some people can run with that and say, well, we need to be at war with every dictator out there. And others say, well, you only need to worry about those who are a direct and immediate threat to us. And then we can even debate what that even means. But that stands in contrast to a more Woodrow Wilson, or I even would say Barack Obama, or especially a more far left internationalist approach, that in reality, we are not at threat, and that we are often our biggest enemy. The only reason we're ever at threat is because we've mucked around and meddled too much in these international affairs in the first place. And therefore, this world could, in fact, be a safe haven for liberal democracies if we would just leave well enough alone.
Mm.
Again, very broad. There are some valid talking points there, but I guess that's what I would say is I think that's my concern, because these things internationally take decades usually before we truly know what the full fruition of a lot of our foreign policies will be. And so it's not as if you can just draw straight lines all the time. A world in which the United States has checked out and is exhausted and is not as readily available to defend its interests if need be is a more dangerous world for a whole host of reasons that I think in coming generations we may unfortunately learn.
And then on the economic side, what do you see
Yeah,
there? I mean, I'm
very
assuming
similar.
it's I'm assuming it's capitalism doesn't work. I mean, at least
Yes.
that's the simplified boiled down. talking point I think you hear from a lot of folks.
And I can't remember offhand. I used to know this offhand. The statistic: millennials, the surprising number of millennials who support socialism, just in polling, when asked the question, socialism or capitalism, it's either 50% or maybe even, it's probably even more than that. Of course, there's also the interesting follow up question, which is, what is socialism? And it's not as common that the individual says, I support socialism, supports what is traditionally held to be that. I think what it actually means is most millennials would say, whatever we have now, I don't like that.
Hmm.
And that's a fair critique. Um, I would say of capitalism or of the economic model, or what the right has often advocated, honestly, you could think of it really dang similar to the foreign policy issue, right? It's not that the right suddenly embraced the left; it's that the right, you can get a lot of mileage by criticizing the Reaganist or traditional conservative understandings of the 1980s economic policies. You even see this today in Trump. Oftentimes, there's more of a protectionist mindset, or a mindset that what we really need is better trade policies, that the rich are just keep getting richer, and that we need a more protection for workers. Again, these are perfectly valid talking points, but it's not what conservatism has traditionally tried to champion. And I think that it's not socialism necessarily, but it's almost more protectionism, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
There's almost an invalidating of the entire free market enterprise. The problem is, prior to 2008, there was almost a global invalidating of socialism with the fall of the Soviet Union. And so we're sort of left in this murky middle where there aren't nearly as many true evangelists of economic models. There are definitely some, but it's not like it used to be. And so we're kind of in this almost this negative, like, whatever we have now is unfair, it's unjust, and it needs to change, without a lot of specifics of what exactly we're advocating.
So, Josh, I want to go back. Maybe take a couple steps back here, as we've already kind of dove into some subject here. You've been advocating for what I would call and what you have called a traditional approach to conservative thinking, or a conservative way. You've referenced Edmund Burke, Thomas Sowell, William F. Buckley as some of those foundational forebearers of the conservative movement. What for you got you interested in all this?
I I think it's as simple as, for whatever reason, I was never interested in sports growing up. So this is kind of my sports, right? Is politics. I think we all have things that ping our brains for some reason or another. We don't know. Maybe I was adopted because nobody in my family ever had this drive. um, that being said, I was always interested in politics, but as a kid, the interest was listening to Rush Limbaugh and Democrat bad, Republican good kind of thing. It was almost more of a team sport game. There wasn't a
Mhm.
lot of thought into it. As I began to grow and develop, and I'm kind of one of those curious individuals that just enjoys the intellectual pursuits. I don't mean that I'm intelligent. I just mean that that's something I find fascinating. And in particular, the 2016 election, I think, really helped incentivize me to dig in and say, okay, what is conservatism? I've heard these names before. I've never read Edmund Burke. I've never read Russell Kirk. I know they're supposed to be influential. I know they're supposed to be part of the driving forces of the higher thoughts behind where we come up with these ideas in the first place. Or, well, to be fair to them, they would say not come up with the ideas, but rather that they didn't discover the ideas, they just unearthed what was already there, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think in that pursuit, as early as 2016 onward, the more I read, the more I was kind of addicted to this. I was like, why has nobody ever told me about that? Like, there's a well with seemingly no bottom here of just information and battles between people on the right of what these things mean, these higher concepts, that it just seems so juvenile to listen to what we typically think of as political dialogue and debate, when
Mm.
you see what these very brilliant individuals of old had to say.
What was it that captured your attention? What are they advocating for that you said, "Oh my gosh, this is," to what you just said, "This is so
Mhm.
different than what I'm hearing from these traditional," I'll put in air quotes, "conservative thinkers or personalities." What was it that captured your attention, Josh?
Well, for one thing, it was kind of twofold. One thing was, in a negative sense, I would say it was um, I'm not saying anything new here. The visceral, the hatred, the small-mindedness of our political dialogue today is exhausting, and some
Hmm.
people find it fun, and there are certainly elements of it that can be fun to pursue. But in the end, that's not what I want to build my life around. It seems kind of silly, um, and so it was almost like, oh, there's an alternative. I can immerse myself in politics without feeling like I need to repent to Jesus every Sunday, kind of thing. Um, so on the other side, I would say that what kind of captured me, and maybe this is getting a little meta, but it may be the closest I can explain it. Conservatism, at least as I understand it, the intellectual pursuit, is a non-systematic political a worldview. It's a little controversial. Some people would call it an ideology. Others, like Russell Kirk, would be very clear this is not an ideology. And they would say that because by ideology, that typically means system. It typically means here is how humans are supposed to live.
Mm.
Conservatism is very messy. It has some universal truths, but one of the ideas embedded within conservatism is that, as I often say, what it means for me to be a 21st century American conservative is necessarily different than what it would mean for me to be, say, a 14th century Ottoman Empire conservative. We're conserving very different ideas. So there's a sort of war between, are there universal principles we're conserving, or are they unique to our culture and our history and our identification? And I would say it's a little of both. But because it's a little of both, conservatism is going to naturally be different than, say, liberalism or socialism or almost any other ism, which is more of a, here is how humans are to live, regardless of where you live, regardless of time or place. It's a systematic approach to here is what's right or wrong. Conservatism is we believe in higher truths, but we don't believe we mere humans have the ability to pull them down from the heavens and then implement them in political policies. It would be kind of like saying, how much does the human soul weigh? It's like, well, we believe there's a soul, but we're limited in our capacity to truly measure it scientifically and implement it in a rational process. So I think that really, like I said, it's very meta, but that really appealed to me because I think that life is that mess. It's it's not purely rational. There's a mystery to it, and there's a beauty in that mystery. And that does not mean that you shut your mind off to reason. It just means you recognize your own limitations within that reason. That it necessarily exists within a tradition and sometimes within revealed truths, and that comported that political pursuit comported to every aspect of my life. Philosophically or religiously, and it just all seemed to fit, and it flowed naturally, if you will.
That messiness that you just talked about, Josh, that messiness with some universal truths. And I want to get to that, what those are here in a bit. But the question that comes up I hear you say that is, okay, in a country of 300 plus million people, is a conservative approach, will it work? If it's that messy, will it
Hmm.
work as a I don't want to say structure of government, because I think you were trying to get away from that a little bit. So I'm trying to use some of your language here. But will that work in governing a country?
Yeah. So at the far end of, say, the intellectual conservatives is the East Coast Straussians, and maybe there are those who are a little further out than this, but they are often criticized as being those extremely intelligent people. By the way, I mean just way more intelligent than I could ever hope to be. Very well read, very well argued, but they spend all their time, in a sense, this is the criticism, of sort of being in their ivory tower arguing these higher principles.
Mm.
And it's like, cool, so what should the tax rate be? Right? How does that help me at all? And so this is the great battle, if you will. And this is one of the, you mentioned those names earlier. Um, uh, Edmund Burke is definitely, he was a statesman. He was actually a British politician. So to me, he's almost the gold star because he's this almost perfect blend of arguing with the metaphysicians and arguing on these deeper levels, but also like, okay, but at the end of the day, we have to come up with practical policies.
Mhm.
In an American sense, I don't know if there's a perfect guide star here, but William F. Buckley, I think, is one that was very well suited to kind of putting together movement conservatism and I did not. I shouldn't say did. I wasn't alive at the time he was doing it. I do not agree with all of the political stances Buckley took at all. There were some that I think were very ill-advised, to put it mildly. That being said, and unfortunately, this is, I think, why those East Coast Straussians like to stay in their ivory towers, because so long as you deal in the realm of philosophy, you don't have to worry about all the dirtiness of politics.
Uh-huh.
And
And
that is the
policy.
difficulty. Yeah, the
Yeah.
policy is when it becomes difficult, because it turns out, and you're right, the muck, the messiness of conservatism means there is no such thing as a here is the conservative policy. You're going to get two different conservatives in a room. They're going to argue, two different sides of whether or not that's the right approach. And it becomes it's very difficult to translate this in a means that's um, um, that you can put on political slogans and advocate policies. There are some
Mm.
individuals who've done it very well.
Mm-hmm.
Ronald Reagan, for instance, again, don't approve of everything he did, um, was one of possibly the best to say, here are these deeper principles, but I'm going to communicate this in a way so that the average Joe can just sort of talk about it down to these slogans. Now, there's a danger there, because when you reduce it to slogans, it loses its higher meaning, but it's necessary to sort of advance policy. So I don't have an answer to your question other than just acknowledge, yeah, it's tough. And that's the great battle of every generation of conservatives.
And that flows in direct contrast to a lot of what we see in politics. And to be very fair, a lot of politics works. A lot of our government
Mm,
in the United States works. There is policy and procedure that is passed bipartisan in a bipartisan way that works. We just don't hear about it as often. But a lot of the stuff that we are inundated with is that we want to reduce everything into this box where this is the conservative or Republican way to govern, and this is the liberal or Democrat way to govern. And
yeah.
it just it causes some of these, even the conversation up to here, we've been recording for 22 minutes now, the nuance that we could dive into with everything that you've said, Josh, like this does not happen when we're talking about for instance, presidential candidate campaigning for office.
Right.
This level of nuance did not happen, did not, you don't hear this out of, for instance, Donald Trump's mouth. You just don't.
Yeah.
So
Well,
my
and
question in that, well,
yeah.
you were going to say something. I'll give you a chance to respond to
Oh
that
no,
before I ask my next
I was just going
question.
to agree with you. You don't hear it out of his mouth, but sadly, that's where he gets a lot of his support, is
Yeah.
because you put me up on a stage running for president, I'm not going to do nearly as well as Donald Trump. This is not what people want to hear, and that's the great challenge: is how do you communicate deeper truths to people in a way that hits them where they're at? And that's not a criticism of people, by the way. I'm the weird one. I don't expect most people to be reading, as the Andrew Heaton, the comedian, says, wandering around late at night saying, what would Edmund Burke do in this situation? That's the weird one, right? And that's fine. If you want a functioning country where people are not all focused on politics, that's a very dangerous country if everybody's focused on politics.
Sure.
Um, and so but I think there is a necessity in a system of ordered liberty in a society in which we are self-governance. I think it is necessary, not that we all become political philosophers, but that we learn to develop a skill to understand the difference between what is healthy and what is auspicious and what is conducive to good government. And I think by almost any measurement, and we could talk about a lot of names, but Donald Trump is the opposite of every single one of those things.
Hmm.
So I am critical of the larger populace that supports a politician such as that, not because they haven't spent time reading Edmund Burke, but because they ought to be attuned to this is leaning more towards demagogic expressions of sort of dividing the people, and I could go on and on and on. And this is not who is fit to be a leader of a free country.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, those universal truths of
Mhm.
conservatism. I wrote down what you said. It's messy, but there is some universal truths, but has some universal truths. What are those?
Yeah, I don't know if I could list all of them
Yeah, well, yeah.
succinctly. So, and it depends on what kind of a conservative you ask. A Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk conservative such as me, or such as myself, is very reticent to say, well, here are the 12, right? Or
Sure.
here's a list. Although the irony is, one of the most famous things Russell Kirk ever wrote was the 10 conservative principles, and he wrote them down. Here are the 10. I don't think he liked that that's what he was kind of known for. Um, a Straussian conservative would be more likely to look to aspects of the American founding, and Burkean conservatives are too, to say that part of those universal truths is simply the most beautiful sentiment is within the Declaration of Independence that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the original understanding of that from John Locke was not the pursuit of happiness, but was rather property rights, which is sort of understood to be how does one pursue happiness if you deprive them of the very means, the tools by which they could pursue that? So I think that's a good bedrock, a good place to start. Oftentimes, the Burkeans would argue back to that. Well, that's fine. The problem there being something can be metaphysically true. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and yet politically highly impractical. It would be irrational to go to North Korea, depose the dictator, and say, hey, here are your rights. Good luck to you. That is
Mm.
not a society that is conducive to protecting those rights. And so a Burkean conservative says these rights are realized and developed and defended through the slow, messy, and difficult process of time and as a culture develops, moving more and more towards, we hope, a perfect union while making plenty of mistakes along the way. And so, therefore, from that lens, these universal truths become things more like God's providence, or there is a sort of directing of human nature. They become things more like, as I mentioned earlier, the generations connecting between the living, the dead, and the unborn. That invokes a sort of responsibility on our end, while also a recognition that we enjoy certain rights because of where we're born into, not because we can just demand these with like a clenched fist saying, this is my right, but almost it's an inheritance, right? This is this precious gift that I, as an American, that you, as an American, can enjoy that's been handed down to us. But we also have this responsibility to bear this cost, to bear it to the next generation. There's a lot more from there, but this conversation may be way more meta than you were looking for. So maybe I'll shut up and see if you had a follow up there.
Well, I'm struck by one of the critiques that I hear of what you just said of conservatism, that more not the hijacked version of conservatism that I think we see. And I've said many times on this show now, I grew up Republican. I don't consider myself a Republican anymore, although I probably in a lot of ways lean conservative, but also in some areas I lean more left. Uh, One of the critiques that I often hear is, especially looking back at the founding of this country, this model or this bubble is placed over it, and all of the wrongs that were going on culturally at that time, and
Hmm.
assigning that label to conservatism, where conservatism, and you even wrote it on your website, is applying the wisdom of the past to the challenges of today. And people, the critique of conservatism is, you're trying to take us back there. You're trying to take us back there to that time culturally. And I think missing the point of those greater truths. And you even admitted it there in your answer to that previous question, which was, these are the universal truths, and we're trying to apply them culturally and messing up a lot along the way. You didn't say
Yeah.
exactly that way, but I think where, and I want your thoughts on this, where I see conservatives making the mistake of responding to that criticism is not admitting the mistakes of the past. Do you
Yeah.
sense the same?
Oh boy, this is a big subject. I mean, we could do episodes on this, right? And it uh, much earlier in the conversation when I kind of mentioned the two big things that I think um, make conservatism a challenge for millennials to accept, being the 2008 market collapse and then the war on terror. If I were to add a third thing, it's not an instance; it's more the cultural milieu that we're swimming in, which is conservatives, and I celebrate this. Uh, I'm possibly Gen Z and the Alpha generation are going to supersede us, but today, we are the most diverse generation, not only in American history, but so far as I can tell, in world history that has
Mhm.
ever existed.
Mhm.
That we have a greater tendency to break down cultural, racial, sexual orientation barriers than previous generations. Now, as a conservative, I think human nature is relatively fixed. I don't think we're going to eradicate racism. I think that's unfortunately kind of wired in our DNA. Same with a lot of other isms, but I think we've made greater strides than others. And I bring that up to say that in light of will conservatism survive, it has to find a way to acknowledge these wrongs of the past. Look, I'll just say it. I'm a straight heterosexual Caucasian male, right?
Hmm.
So I don't want to come off as if I'm the spokesperson for these injustices that were suffered by minorities and others within the country.
Hmm.
But it doesn't mean I have nothing to say about it. It just means that I'm not. Um, I acknowledge there's a natural limitation to how far I can go with it.
Hmm.
Um, that is a very fair criticism, and I think it is something that is on two levels. One is, yes, the right often loses sight of when talking about how we're trying to return to some sense of something, to not acknowledge the progress that has been made. Now, I will, I've mentioned his name so many times. This whole notion of
Hmm.
the three generations, the living, the dead, and the yet to be born, I think is one of the ways you potentially escape that. Because in reality, conservatism, at least as I would hope it manifest itself, is not trying to pull us back to some utopic past. It's rather trying to acknowledge that throughout humanity's existence, there are certain key lessons and traditions that survive for good reason. And we absolutely can question those things. We can absolutely change them, but we need to do so with a great deal of fear and trepidation and sobriety. That our bias ought to be, if it's the tradition, we need to replace it for good reason.
Hmm.
And if we have replaced it hastily, we need to consistently re-examine why and was that a mistake. Um, I think that allows one to acknowledge the horrible mistakes that have happened in the past, uh, while not saying that that somehow by suggesting the founding fathers had some good ideas, we have to sort of ignore what their views on slavery were, or or maybe I shouldn't say their views, what their actual practices
Right.
on
Right.
slavery was.
Right.
And like I said, there's a lot there. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll pause there to see if that at least makes some
I
sense.
think that's fair. Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's a fair answer, Josh. Um, as we kind of move the conversation forward here, I'm curious. You have been, yeah, I mean, on your website, you've made it very clear you are not a fan of Donald Trump. You are not a fan of the populist nationalism that we see from a lot of his campaigning, his messaging, his support. W- I don't want to use that language. The question, okay, so I'll just say the question and then maybe try and backtrack a little bit. How do we combat it? Like how do conservative thinkers gain a voice when you're up against that bombastic of a personality,
Mhm.
that that toxic of a relationship, to people who disagree with you? How do we gain a voice? Because I feel like it's a struggle right now.
Yeah, I think here again is something that we could answer on multiple levels. If what you're asking is how do you gain a voice among your close friend or relative, I unfortunately I don't know that I really have much of an answer other than an enormous amount of patience and humility, and a desire to broaden one's relationship and draw closer to a person even as it's difficult. I think that people, um, as I often say, if I reflect myself, and I assume you're probably the same way, and probably everybody listening, if they truly reflect on how did I become the person I am today, how did I come to believe the things I do today, and who are those people that influenced me, I think those individuals would probably be shocked at what they did or said that actually formed you into the person you were.
Mhm.
It wasn't that one speech they gave. It was just that one act of kindness they did that one time that they probably have forgotten about that have formed you into that. And so I think there is at first a need for a recognition that this is a problem. It's a big problem, but that we are not the saviors of the world. And the best we can do is our tiny little part, trusting that it's doing some good somewhere, that we are probably going to be dead and never know that it helped someone. That's on one level. I don't. There are aspects in which if you're close enough to somebody and they genuinely want to know, you can of course engage. I just think that often you can't change hearts or minds until a person, and it's not a fake. It's not a fake sincerity. You
Mm-hmm.
genuinely want the best for the person, and you're
Mm-hmm.
engaged in an actual dialogue back and forth. And even then, it's likely not going to bear fruit anytime soon, and you may never see it. Um, on the other hand, on a broader level, I think that what we're seeing is, and this is getting very, to zoom this back quite a bit. I think what we're seeing is humans are, whether you believe created this way or biologically evolved this way, or maybe a combination of the two, naturally tribalistic. And I think if you just put a group of humans together and sort of let them have at it, they're either going to form sort of warring, roving tribal bands, or if I think as the state increases in power and size, a monarch of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And a monarch doesn't have to be, it can be conducive to liberty. Usually it's not. We have something really weird in the United States, the most audacious experiment. Maybe you could say the Soviets were a bit more audacious than us, but one of the most audacious experiments ever that is not natural. And I think that's a good starting place. As Thomas Sowell, the economist, says often that people are often studying the causes of poverty. He says that can be interesting, but we know why poverty exists. We are born into the world with nothing. We die with nothing. It's the real question is, how do people gain wealth at all? And I
Mm.
think that's possibly part of the answer to this is like, how do people live in ordered liberty at all? How do we live with self governance? The founding fathers talked often about how this was a difficult process. I mean, one of his most, was kind of a joke, but I think there's a lot of truth to it when Benjamin Franklin was asked by a bystander as he's passing by during the during the debates that formed the American government, what have you given us? Mr. Franklin says, a republic if you can keep it. And I think while there are specific odious elements of Trumpism per se, I think that's just normal humans when the system isn't working, when it's sick. I think there are various elements of populism that spring up all over the place. Trump just happens to be the most prominent at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
There could be leftist versions of populism. There has been leftist versions of populism in the past. And so I think there's no one solution. It's just we have a sick society and we need to recultivate those virtues um, that the founders preached, the civic Republican, small r, Republican virtues that make people fit for self governance.
Which are?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I heard a podcaster, talk about that for a solid hour without ever defining them, and I don't know if I'm going to get much closer. But I think I think they're the relatively obvious low hanging fruits. I think there's a sense of sobriety. I think there's a sense that, as Madison taught, democracy necessarily means we're not all going to get what we want. And so, sort of a learning how to very carefully identify what is a constitutional crisis and what is not ideal. If Donald Trump or when Obama and Biden and Trump were elected, I mean, we heard from half the country this was the end of America almost.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wasn't. They weren't ideal. I certainly don't think any of them were wonderful presidents, but we survived. And learning how to distinguish between something, say, like the Civil War versus the most recent debate over what the tax policy should be, and not making everything a hill we need to die on, while at the same while recognizing that my greatest political contribution to this country is not my vote, it's actually behaving like a responsible citizen, paying my taxes, working hard, minding the affairs of my marriage and my family. Um, I mean, maybe it seems trite and simple, but it is true. A people who don't govern themselves are not apt for self governance. And so it's not about electing the right people, it's about us behaving as if we don't need some dictator to keep us all in line.
Mm. Oh, I like that. I like that, Josh. I want to go back to before I ask you my last question. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is something I wrote. Written about in my book, which is coming out later this year. It's the process that I am advocating for here on this show, which is what I call the psychology of communication, of conflict communication. That you take the approach of ask, that you
Mm,
assume positive intent of others, that you set aside your ego, that you know that you can't know everything. And so you ask questions of yourself first, of about others second, and then of others, third. And that process of asking questions of yourself. When did I first state my political beliefs? And who influenced those? Were they my words, or were they a conglomeration of all the influential people in my life? And
Hmm.
to go back to you, you said 2016 was really the point where you started to mold and shape that for yourself. I'm curious, what differences did you find there in that self-exploration of what you thought you believed or said you believed or articulated you believed at the time, and
Hmm.
how that shifted for you in doing that exploration of yourself?
Well, my struggle here is that I wish I could reach for one very clear example instead of as like 10,000 small
Yeah.
things, where I feel as if I have become more conservative while recognizing that that which I thought was conservative has more shifted into the background.
Mm.
And there was this interesting study done once, and this is maybe if there is a thought experiment here, this might help. An interesting study done once that followed couples on their first date, and if they got married, would check in with them many years later. And what the study had found was these couples were asked to assess how well that first date went, and so they would sort of measure, scale 1 to 10 or however they would ask those questions, and then like 5, 7, 10 years later, they would come back to them in their marriage, and they would ask them at that time, "How do you assess your marriage, the quality of your marriage, the happiness of your marriage, scale 1 to 10 or whatever?" And then they would ask them, "Okay, remember that first date you're on? Remind us again, how well did that first date go?" And what they had discovered was if the couple's marriage went well, they misremembered their first date as being better than what they had originally said. And conversely, if their marriage was going poorly, they seemed to remember that first date was actually pretty awful, when maybe at the time they didn't think so. They thought it was pretty good. And the reason I say that is I think we humans do this a lot. In 2016, as I began to develop differently, it's almost like I could look back in the past and be like, oh, I am remembering things different. It turns out that the guy spouting this crazy thing about Barack Obama's not a natural born citizen, he's a Muslim, is going to take us all to some sort of a issue in the new Islamic caliphate or something to that effect. That wasn't just that one weird crazy uncle that shows up at Thanksgiving. Maybe they're a sizable minority within the party, and that's an odious element that we need to effectively deal with.
Mm.
And I just began to see those things differently. Again, let me emphasize there are people all across the political spectrum that have stupid political theories that are themselves very decent people. And so they maybe don't need the microphone. Maybe that's part of the world we live in with social media. Everybody's got a microphone, but
It's easy to start a
um,
podcast.
yeah, it is. It's even easier to tweet something.
Right.
Um, yeah, and hopefully that's not me half the time, but
Yeah, same.
um, yeah, yeah. But I wished I could just point to one single example. I think it was more of that. It was more of a sort of awareness that I didn't want to disavow everything.
Mhm.
And I don't feel like I have. There was so much value in my past. But it was more of I recognize that I'm not as aligned with individuals that I thought I was. And in some cases, I recognize I'm more aligned with others that I thought I had nothing in common with.
Yeah. Yeah, that process, and I reiterate this in the book. Um, it's not a questioning of yourself to find out what you believe or what you say is wrong. That's not what the goal is. The goal
Hmm.
is to just find what it is that you actually believe and how you might see, to your point, how you might see things a little bit differently, or affirm what you know to be true or what you
Yeah.
believe. So, yeah, it is not a process of asking questions of yourself to prove yourself wrong. That's not it at all. So I love that answer, Josh. What's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Where can I send you money? I don't.
Okay, same.
No, I said it. Yeah, yeah. No, Saving Elephants is a strictly not-for-profit venture. So I'm. Um, question I wished I was asked more. Honestly, maybe it's low hanging fruit, but the sort of questions you've been asking me. I mean, I this is a failure of mine. As I mentioned earlier, you put me up on stage against Donald Trump. Obviously, people are going to be more inclined to vote for Trump. I wished people were more curious. The problem is I can't change the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recognize that even in that there may be value in people being more curious. I also recognize that there is a danger in me presuming the world would be a better place if they could accommodate me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's probably an inability for me to truly understand the value in others and their approach. Um, and maybe this is, I don't know that this is even an answer to that question, but I guess that's kind of the thing is there are all kinds of questions I wished I were asked more often. Um, but I wonder sometimes with the fact that I'm not asked those questions means I need to be more aware of how to communicate better with individuals that aren't as apt to ask those questions. I don't think I even answered that at all, but maybe you can work with
I
that.
liked what you said. I liked anyway, so we'll just roll with it. What I appreciate, Josh, is the entire time, certainly in the back half of this conversation, there's been an undertone of your answers of control what you can control. Even in
Mm.
your answer just
Mhm.
there, it is, I'm not trying to get the world to bend to my will, believing narcissistically that my way is the best way. You talked about being what it means to be a good citizen. All of those things are control what you can control, and the idea being that that will trickle up into you know politics or the larger issues of the day that we face. We may not even need to talk about you know the federal government if we
Mm.
be good citizens in our daily lives. That's a really interesting thought process for, I think, the listeners to leave with and take with them out of this conversation. So thank you, Josh, for showing up here, for being willing to go to these places with me. I appreciate it. As messy as you may have thought some of the answers were, I thought they were great. So thanks
No,
for
thank you.
thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it, man.
Absolutely, Michael. Great to talk to you.
My friend, be careful of reductionist language and using it to distance yourself from things that you want to be able to control but ultimately can't. It might feel more difficult to avoid it. It might feel more difficult to not use reductionist language and lean into nuance. It certainly takes more time to talk through nuanced ideas and to avoid reducing things to their most basic binary forms of good versus evil, bad versus wrong or right, fair versus unfair, all those things. But it's worth it if we are to have more accurate disagreements and show up in conversations and in everyday lives as citizens to be able to affect the things that we can affect. To be able to have accurate disagreements, to be able to lean into conversations where conflict may be present, where we actually have some sort of an ability to affect change. Not saying that we don't at the federal level or at the global level, but we too often wrap ourselves up in those issues and those challenges when the ability to affect that change is so distant, and the uptake would be so difficult and challenging. And we miss what's right in front of us. We miss the people like Josh, who perhaps give us a different view of this word, conservatism, that has been hijacked. And we can call out bad actors, we can call out things that we disagree with, but when faced with the individual in front of us, it is important that we are able to communicate accurately through that disagreement. And reductionist language does not help. That's the communication lesson I hope you take from this conversation. So I want to thank Josh for coming on and sharing his story, his perspective here on the show. Do us a huge favor, share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to this conversation. Your network, the people that you know, help us spread the good word with those people about the importance of asking more questions and leaning into positive, accurate communication, even through disagreement. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Josh that I have on each and every episode, subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. You can always get in touch with me on my website. It's michaelashford.com, or feel free to email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, and let's start a conversation. I'll catch you on the next episode of the follow-up question. And until then, keep asking questions.